The first warning wasn't a sound.
It was the silence.
Stone Age medicine, outsmarting everything in his kit.
Morning didn't break. It bruised. If that trap door opens and it ain't my face, you empty that iron.
Winter was the season of hunger, but also the season of harvest.
The brain has the oil, the fat that likes water.
In the territory, goodbyes were a luxury for people sure of return.
The first warning wasn't a sound. It was the silence. Silas Cooper knew the acoustics of death. He had lived in the Wind River Range long enough to know that when the wind howled through the Douglas firs, it was just the mountain breathing. But when the wind stopped, when the heavy wet silence of a deep freeze settled like a lead blanket, that was when the mountain was holding its breath, waiting to snap a branch, a bone, or a life. It was December 1880. The thermometer nailed to the porch post had bottomed out at 30 below zero. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and wet dog. Boots, a blue-tick coonhound with one cloudy eye and a hip that predicted weather better than any barometer, lay near the cast-iron stove, twitching in his sleep. Silas sat in his rocking chair, the one he'd carved from hickory, holding a glass of whiskey that was technically too expensive for a man of his means. He was reading the label to the dog. It was a ritual, a way to keep his voice from rusting shut. Distilled in Kentucky, Silas rasped his voice, sounding like gravel grinding under a boot heel. Aged in charred oak barrels. You hear that, Boots? Charred oak, just like us. Burnt on the outside, full of fire on the inside. Boots didn't wake up. Silas reached for the Sears and Roebuck catalog on the table. It was the 1879 edition, dog-eared and stained with coffee rings. It was his connection to a world he had abandoned, a world of corset covers, patent medicines, and steam engines. He flipped to page 322, staring at a sketch of a parlor organ. He didn't play, but he liked looking at things that were complicated and unnecessary. It made the brutal simplicity of his life feel like a choice. Then the silence broke. It wasn't a knock. You didn't knock in this country. You announced yourself before you were within rifle range, or you risked getting buried before spring. Hello, the house. The scream tore through the timber walls. It was desperate, high-pitched and strained. Silas didn't jump. He didn't spill his whiskey. His movement was fluid, practiced. In one motion he blew out the tallow candle on the table and slid the Winchester 1873 from its rest beside the door. The darkness of the cabin became his shield. He moved to the window, peering through the frosted glass he'd wiped clear with a rag dipped in alcohol. Outside, the snow was a blue-gray ocean under the moonlight. At the edge of the clearing, a shadow dragged itself across the white crust. It wasn't a horse. It was a person crawling. Silas cracked the door 3 inches. The cold air hissed in like a snake. State your business, Silas roared, the barrel of his rifle resting on the doorframe. And keep your hands where God put 'em. The figure collapsed face first into the snow. Silas cursed. He knew the trap. A feigned injury to draw the homeowner out, followed by a bullet from the tree line. He waited. 10 seconds. 20. The figure didn't move. The snow around the leg was turning a dark, oily black in the moonlight. Blood. Hellfire, Silas muttered. He didn't run. Running was for prey. He moved with a low, sliding gait, scanning the tree line. He grabbed the figure by the back of a deer-hide tunic and dragged. He hauled the weight backward, his boots digging into the ice until he crossed the threshold. He kicked the door shut and threw the heavy oak bolt. Only then did he relight the lantern. The light flickered over the intruder. It was a woman. Nez Perce. She couldn't have been more than 30, but the lines around her eyes held a century of hard winters. Her lips were blue, but what caught Silas's eye was the leg. A ragged hole in her buckskin leggings just above the knee. She wasn't just freezing. She was bleeding out. Silas looked at her, then at the rifle in her hand, an old Spencer carbine, empty. She gripped it, even in unconsciousness. "Well, Boots," Silas whispered, looking at the pool of blood expanding on his floorboards. "Looks like Christmas came early. And it brought trouble." The woman didn't just wake up. She exploded from the depths of unconsciousness with the violence of a cornered cougar. One moment she was a limp rag doll on the floorboards, the next, as the cold steel of Silas's skinning knife grazed the buckskin of her pant leg, she was a blur of motion. Her eyes snapped open, obsidian black, dilated with shock terror and a lethal intent that froze Silas's blood for a fraction of a second. She didn't scream. Screaming was a waste of breath in the high country. Instead, she thrashed her back, arching off the floor, her right hand clawing desperately at her hip for a sheath knife that wasn't there. "Easy," Silas barked, dropping his own blade and throwing his weight forward. He pinned her shoulder to the rough-hewn planks with a hand that had wrestled stubborn mules and skinned frozen beavers. "Unless you want to bleed dry on my rug, you'll lie still. That leg needs looking at, and I ain't keen on burying you tonight." The woman froze. It wasn't surrender, it was a tactical pause. Her muscles remained coiled like steel springs beneath the blood-stiffened leather of her tunic. Her chest heaved, short, sharp rasps of air whistling through clenched teeth. She scanned the room in a series of rapid, jerky movements. She assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a survivor. She saw the gray in Silas's beard, the deep fissures of weather on his face, and the calluses on his hands that clamped her shoulder like a vice. Her eyes darted to the Winchester leaning against the wall, lever closed, hammer down, loaded but 5 feet out of reach. She looked at the fire in the stove, then back at Silas. She realized 2 things: he was stronger than her in her current state, and if he wanted her dead, he would have left her in the snow. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath that rattled in her chest. She nodded once. Sharp. A truce. Silas didn't let go immediately. He waited until he felt the tension ebb slightly from her frame before he sat back on his heels. He picked up his knife again. "I'm cutting the leather," he muttered, holding the blade up so she could see it. Just the leather. He worked quickly, the blade parting the heavy sodden buckskin. The smell hit him first, the copper tang of fresh blood mixed with the musty odor of old sweat and wet wool. When he peeled the fabric back, he couldn't help but hiss through his teeth. It was a gunshot wound, ugly and angry. A heavy caliber, likely A. 45 or A. 50-70 government round. It had punched through the meat of the outer thigh. It was a through and through which was a small mercy, no lead to dig out, but the exit wound was a jagged crater where the bullet had tumbled. It had missed the femoral artery by the grace of God in half an inch, but it had torn through muscle and smaller vessels. It was pumping bright, oxygenated red in a rhythm that matched her frantic heartbeat. Silas wiped his hands on a rag. His mind raced through his limited medical options. He had no sutures, no laudanum, no carbolic acid. In the mountains, infection killed more men than bears or blizzards combined. If the blood loss didn't take her, the gangrene would. He stood up and walked to the cast-iron stove. He grabbed a different knife, a heavy-bladed bowie he used for chopping kindling, and shoved the blade into the glowing red embers of the firebox. "I'm gonna heat this iron," Silas said, his voice flat, trying to detach himself from the cruelty of the necessary act. "Cauterize it. It's the only way to stop that flow. It's gonna hurt like the devil, and you're gonna want to scream. You go right ahead." He turned back to face her. The woman's eyes had gone wide, the pupils swallowing the irises. The look on her face wasn't just fear of pain, It was horror. She looked at the glowing stove, then at her leg, and shook her head violently. No, the word was a guttural choke. She struggled to sit up, her elbows skidding on the blood-slicked floor. She pointed a trembling finger upward toward the dark, soot-stained rafters of the cabin. Silas frowned, his hand hovering over the handle of the heating knife. "What you want to pray a little late for that, sister?" She shook her head again, more frantic this time. She made a sweeping motion with her hand, mimicking a brush but delicate. Then she pointed insistently to the far corner of the ceiling, where the shadows were deepest and the firelight barely reached. "Webs?" Silas asked, the confusion evident in his gravelly voice. "Spider webs," she nodded, her face pale as ash, sweat beading on her upper lip. She tapped her wound, mimicking the flow of blood, then pointed at the ceiling again. "Put the webs on the blood." Silas hesitated. He was a man of the frontier, a pragmatist who believed in what he could see and touch. He believed in whiskey for pain, quinine for fever, and fire for bleeding. He had seen men scream their throats raw while a hot iron sealed a stump. It was brutal, barbaric, and effective. But he also knew something else. He knew that the Nez Perce, the Shoshone, and the Crow had lived in these mountains for 1,000 years before a white man ever set a boot print here. They survived things that killed settlers in days. They knew the plants, the roots, and the secrets of the land that weren't written in his Sears and Roebuck catalog. He looked at the glowing firebox, then at the pleading intelligence in her eyes. "Your funeral," Silas grunted. He abandoned the knife in the stove. He grabbed a cornstraw broom from the corner, intending to sweep down the cobwebs draped near the window. The woman hissed like a viper. "Cesses," she waved her hand dismissively at the broom. She gestured for him to use the barrel of his rifle. She made a specific motion, a plucking, twisting motion. She shook her head at the gray, dusty webs near the window and pointed instead to the high corner above the cupboard. Silas paused, deciphering the charade. She didn't want the old webs. The gray ones were covered in dust, soot, and the desiccated husks of dead flies. That was dirt. That was infection. She wanted the new silk, the white, sticky strands of a living web. "Clean ones," Silas muttered, realization dawning. "You want the fresh silk?" He reached for his Winchester. He felt ridiculous, a grown man hunting spiders with a high-powered rifle, while a woman bled out on his floor. He moved to the corner she indicated. There, a large barn spider had constructed a masterpiece of engineering, a fresh orb web glistening slightly in the lantern light. Silas extended the rifle barrel, moving with the slow deliberation of a man disarming a trap. He caught the edge of the web and began to twirl. He spun the barrel, winding the silk around the cold steel. The web collapsed, layer upon layer of protein wrapping over itself. He moved to a second web, then a third, gathering a ball of white silk the size of a walnut. It looked like a cocoon of raw cotton. He brought it to her. She didn't recoil from the gun barrel. She reached out with shaking, blood-stained hands and pulled the wad of silk free. She inspected it for a second, checking for dirt, her breathing shallow and ragged. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she jammed the wad of spider silk directly into the gaping hole in her thigh. Silas winced. It went against every medical instinct he possessed. It looked like stuffing trash into a clean wound. "That's gonna fester," he warned. But she ignored him. She pressed her palm over the webs, applying pressure. Silas watched, expecting the blood to simply soak through the flimsy barrier. But that's not what happened. As the bright red blood hit the dense protein mesh of the spider silk, something chemical occurred. The silk didn't just absorb, it reacted. The vitamin K-rich strands trapped the platelets. The structure of the web provided a scaffolding for the blood to cling to. The terrifying rhythmic pump of arterial blood slowed. The bright red darkened as it thickened. It clotted. It was happening faster than Silas had ever seen a bandage work. Within 3 minutes, The flow had turned into a slow, manageable ooze. 2 minutes later, it stopped completely. The woman slumped back against the floor, her eyes closing, her chest heaving with relief. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas whispered, staring at the wound. He had just witnessed a piece of Stone Age biotechnology that outperformed anything in his medical kit. He moved quickly now. He cleaned the edges of the wound with whiskey. She didn't flinch, though her jaw muscle jumped, and bandaged it tightly with strips torn from an old, clean flour sack. He propped her up against the sturdy leg of his hickory table. She was incredibly weak. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold tremors of shock and hypothermia. Her lips were turning a frightening shade of blue again. "Food," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You need sugar. And heat." He went to the cupboard. He didn't have fresh meat. The storm had buried the world outside, and he hadn't checked the trap line in 2 days. He rummaged past the tins of coffee and beans until he found the pie tin covered with a cloth. The vinegar pie. It was a humble creation, a Depression-era delicacy born of scarcity and stubbornness. There were no lemons in the Rockies in December. A man couldn't get citrus if he had a bag of gold dust. So pioneers made do. They used eggs, sugar, butter, nutmeg, and apple cider vinegar. The vinegar, when baked with the sugar, lost its harsh bite and mimicked the tart, acidic brightness of lemon custard. Silas cut a large wedge. The crust was flaky lard and flour, and the filling was golden and dense. He knelt beside her and held it out. She sniffed it suspiciously. It smelled sharp and sweet, a foreign scent to someone used to pemmican and venison. She looked at him, then took the slice. Her hands were still trembling so badly she could barely hold it. She took a bite. Silas watched her reaction. Her eyes closed for a second. The intense sweetness, the fat from the butter, and the quick energy of the sugar hit her bloodstream like lightning. It was exactly what a body in shock craved. She ate the rest in 3 bites, licking the crumbs from her fingers. "Name's Silas," he said, the gruffness returning to his voice, now that the immediate crisis was over. He poured himself a fresh glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the firelight. He didn't drink. Instead, he pushed the bottle across the floorboards toward her. It was a peace offering. A test. She took the bottle. She didn't sip it like a lady at a social. She tilted her head back and took a pull that would have choked a mule. She lowered the bottle, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and let out a long, burning exhale. "Kaya," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, sounding like dry leaves blowing over stones. It was the first time she had spoken a word that wasn't a command or a refusal. Silas nodded, accepting the name. He sat back in his rocking chair, the wood creaking in the silence. "Who shot you, Kaya?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the frosted window, at the black square of night that pressed against the glass. The wind outside had picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, but Silas knew she wasn't listening to the wind. She was listening for what was in the wind. "Blue coats," she said finally. "Not army. Not anymore. Deserters." Silas's grip tightened on his glass. Deserters were the worst kind of men. Men who had broken their oaths. Men who killed for pay or pleasure. Men with no flag and no God. 3 of them, she continued, her English, broken but clear enough. "They tracked me for 2 days. They want the skins." "What skins?" Silas asked. "Beaver, otter." She shook her head weakly. She tapped the leather pouch tied to her waist. It clinked softly. It didn't sound like coins. It sounded duller. "Not gold," she said. "Something else. Something they think is magic. Something they think makes them hide." She looked at Silas, her eyes regaining that lethal intensity he had seen when she first woke up. "They are hunting," she said. "Not for meat. For sport. And they are close. They do not stop for snow." Silas looked at the window. He looked at the heavy oak bolt on the door. He looked at his Winchester. The silence outside was no longer empty. It was waiting. And for the first time in 10 years, Silas realized that the storm wasn't the most dangerous thing on the mountain. Morning didn't break. It bruised. The sun failed to pierce the heavy ceiling of clouds, leaving the valley awash in a flat slate-gray light that offered no warmth and cast no shadows. Inside the cabin, the air was still frigid, the fire banked low to conserve wood. Silas hadn't slept. He sat in his hickory rocker, the Winchester 1873, resting across his knees like a jealous lover. He had spent the long, hollow hours of the night running an oil-soaked rag over the lever action, checking the brass carrier, and counting his rounds. 15 in the tube, 1 in the chamber. It was a lot of firepower for one man, but against 3 rifles, it was just enough to die loudly. Kaya sat near the stove, her injured legs stretched out stiffly before her. She wasn't idle. Her hands, calloused and nimble, were busy braiding a piece of red yarn she had plucked from Silas's Christmas tree into a lock of her hair. It looked like a streak of fresh blood against the obsidian black. It was a death braid, a preparation to meet the Creator. Then the silence of the mountain shattered. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, muffled thud crunch of shod hooves breaking through the snow crust. Silas moved instantly. He didn't rush, he flowed. He stepped to the frosted window, wiping a peephole with his thumb. "Riders," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. 3 of them, coming up the creek bed. They're following the depression, where the snow is softer. Kaya tried to stand her hand instinctively, clawing for the skinning knife on the table. As she put weight on her left leg, her knee buckled. She hissed in pain, grabbing the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "Sit down," Silas commanded, not turning from the window. "You can't run and you can't fight. In that condition, you're just a target practice." "They will burn your house," Kaya said, her eyes wild. "If they find me here, they kill you too. I must leave. I will draw them to the ridge. You step out that door, you're dead in 50 yards. And I don't dig graves in frozen ground." Silas turned from the window. The riders were 200 yards out. He had less than a minute. He moved to the heavy oak dining table in the center of the room. It was a massive slab of rough-hewn timber, built to outlast the apocalypse. Beneath it lay a rug Silas's wife had braided 20 years ago from rags and old shirts. He kicked the rug aside, revealing the bare pine floorboards. To the untrained eye, it was just a floor. But Silas knelt and pressed his thumb into a knot in the wood. A section of the floor, flush with the rest, popped up an inch. He pried the trapdoor open. The smell wafted up instantly, a damp, earthy scent of root vegetables, wet soil, and subterranean cold. The root cellar. It was barely 4 feet deep, dug out to keep potatoes and turnips from freezing in the winter or sprouting in the summer. "Get in," Silas said. Kaya looked down into the black rectangular hole. It looked like a coffin waiting for a body. "It is a grave," she whispered, shrinking back. For a person used to the open sky, the idea of being trapped underground was a horror worse than death. "It's a bunker," Silas corrected, grabbing her arm. "It's the only place in this valley where a bullet won't reach you. Now go." She looked at him, searching for deception. Finding none, she lowered herself into the hole. She groaned as her bad leg took her weight on the ladder, but she made it to the dirt floor. She huddled in the darkness between a bin of sprouting potatoes and a crate of onions. Silas reached into his belt. He pulled out the Colt 1851 Navy revolver. It was an old percussion cap gun, converted to fire metallic cartridges. It was heavy, scarred, and deadly reliable. He handed it down to her, along with the bottle of whiskey. "Don't shoot unless they open this door," he whispered, his face hovering in the square of light above her. "If you hear shouting, you stay put. If you hear shots, you stay put. But if that trapdoor opens, and it ain't my face looking down at you, you empty that iron. And don't miss. Kaya gripped the cold steel of the revolver. She nodded. Silas lowered the trapdoor. Thump. He kicked the braided rug back over the seams. Then, putting his shoulder into it, he dragged the heavy oak table back into place. He positioned it perfectly so that one of the heavy legs rested directly on the edge of the trapdoor, locking it down with weight. He grabbed his tin plate of half-eaten breakfast, cold biscuits, and molasses, and set it on the table directly over the spot where Kaya's head would be. He sat down in the chair facing the door. He placed the Winchester on the table, the muzzle pointing at the door, the hammer pulled back to full cock. Click. He took a sip of cold coffee. He waited. The horses stopped outside. The sound of metal bits jingling. The heavy, crunching steps of men walking on snow. Bang, bang, bang. A heavy-gloved fist pounded the wood. Open up U.S. cavalry business. Silas didn't move. He didn't stand. He just wrapped his hands around his coffee mug to stop them from trembling, not from fear but from the adrenaline dumping into his blood. Doors unlocked, he yelled, his voice sounding older and more frail than he was. If you're friendly. The latch lifted. The door swung inward, bringing a blast of freezing wind and swirling snow into the warm room. 3 men stepped over the threshold. They wore the blue wool of the United States Army, but the uniforms were wrong. Tattered cuffs missing buttons, replaced with twine yellow cavalry scarves stained with tobacco juice and grease. They didn't carry standard-issue Springfields. They carried a mix of repeaters and shotguns. Silas knew the look. He had seen it after the Civil War. These weren't soldiers. These were deserters. Men who had walked away from the fort to hunt for gold furs or blood. They were wolves wearing the skin of sheepdogs. The leader was a tall man, gaunt as a winter wolf, with a jagged white scar running through his left eyebrow, pulling his eyelid into a permanent skeptical squint. He stepped into the room, his spurs jingling a sound meant to intimidate. He looked around the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. He saw the fire. He saw the pathetic Christmas tree with its flower-dipped pine cones. He saw the Sears catalog. Finally, he looked at the old man sitting at the table. Cozy, the leader, sneered, his voice scratching like sandpaper. He sniffed the air loudly. Smells like injured animal in here. Copper. Blood. Silas didn't blink. Smells like wet dog, he said, nodding toward Boots, who was growling low in his throat from the corner, and uninvited guests who forgot to wipe their feet. The leader's eyes narrowed. He laughed, a short barking sound devoid of humor. He walked further into the room, his muddy boots leaving streaks on the clean floor. He walked right up to the table. Silas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The man stopped. He was standing directly on the braided rug, directly over the trapdoor, directly over Kaya's head. Under the floorboards, in the absolute dark, Kaya held her breath. She could hear the creak of the wood as the heavy boots shifted above her. A fine rain of dust and dirt sifted down from the cracks, landing on her cheek. She didn't brush it away. She gripped the Colt Navy with both hands, pointing it straight up at the wooden ceiling, her finger resting on the trigger guard. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. Above, the leader leaned his hip against the table, looming over Silas. We're tracking a runner, the leader said casually, picking up the slice of vinegar pie Silas had left on a side plate. He sniffed it, made a face of disgust, and tossed it onto the floor. Boots lunged for it, but Silas snapped his fingers and the dog held back. Squaw, the leader, continued wiping his hands on his trousers. Shot her yesterday, up on the ridge. Good hit. Lot of blood. Trail ends near your creek. Haven't seen a soul in 3 days, Silas lied. His face was a mask of bored irritation, the face of a hermit who hated company. Storm covered everything. If she's out there, she's dead. Coyotes are probably picking the bones by now. Maybe, the leader said. He leaned closer, invading Silas's personal space. He smelled of stale sweat, unwashed wool, and rot-gut whiskey. Or maybe some bleeding heart took her in, thinking they were doing a Christian deed. The second man, a short rat-faced soldier holding a double-barreled shotgun, was poking through the pile of furs in the corner. "Nice pelts, old man," the rat-faced one called out. "Beaver. Prime winter coat. Worth a few dollars in Laramie." "Leave 'em," Silas warned, his hand moving an inch closer to the trigger of the Winchester. "Those are spoken for." The leader's gaze snapped to the rifle on the table. He smiled. It was a predatory grin showing yellow teeth. "You got a lot of lip for a cripple living alone in the middle of nowhere," the leader said softly. "You know the penalty for harboring a hostile old man. It ain't a fine. It's treason. I could hang you from that pine tree out front and burn this shack to the ground. Nobody would ever know. We'd write it up as an Indian raid." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window seemed to freeze. Silas looked up, locking eyes with the man. He didn't stand. He didn't shout. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a man who has already accepted his own death. "You could try," Silas said, "but take a look at this table. That's a Winchester 1873. Chambered in. 4440. Hammer's back. My finger is inside the guard. At this range, I don't need to aim. I'll blow a hole in your gut the size of a dinner plate before you clear leather." He nodded to the rat-faced man in the corner. "And my dog, he's trained to go for the throat. He'll rip your friend's jugular out before he gets that scattergun leveled." Silas leaned forward slightly, the wood of the chair creaking. "So, Captain, you might get me. You might burn this house. But you won't leave this mountain walking. You'll die screaming in the snow, holding your intestines in your hands. Is she worth it? Is a dead woman worth dying for on Christmas morning?" The leader stared at Silas. He looked for fear. He looked for a bluff. He saw neither. He saw the flat, dead eyes of a man who had seen too much war to be impressed by uniforms. Under the floor, Kaya thumbed the hammer of the Colt back. Click. The sound was tiny, muffled by the thick oak table and the rug. But in the silence of the room, it might as well have been a cannon shot. The leader flinched. His eyes darted down to the floor. Silas didn't breathe. Did he hear it? The leader looked back at Silas, then at the rifle. He calculated the odds. He looked at his men. They looked uneasy. They wanted loot, not a death match with a crazy hermit. "Let's go," the leader spat, stepping back from the table. He stepped off the rug. "She's frozen stiff in a drift somewhere anyway. Waste of time." He turned toward the door. As he passed Boots, he lashed out with a vicious kick, his heavy boot connecting with the old dog's ribs. Boots yelped and skittered across the floor. Silas's finger whitened on the trigger. The barrel of the Winchester tracked the leader's back. One shot. Spine. It would be so easy. But he held. If he shot now, it was war. And Kaya was still in the hole. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," the leader sneered. The door slammed shut. Silas didn't move. He sat like a stone statue, listening. He heard the crunch of snow, the creak of saddle leather, the snort of horses. He waited until the sounds faded, until the only noise was the wind and the whimpering of his dog. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Only then did he exhale his breath, shaking so hard it rattled in his chest. He stood up, his legs trembling, and shoved the heavy oak table aside. He threw back the rug and ripped open the trapdoor. Kaya was staring up at him from the darkness, the Colt Navy pointed straight at his face. She lowered it slowly. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat. You lie well for a white man, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't lie, Silas grunted, reaching down to pull her out of the grave. I just didn't tell them the truth. There's a difference. He pulled her up into the light. She looked at the door, then at him. For the first time, she didn't look at him like a stranger. She looked at him like kin. They will come back, she said. I know, Silas replied, checking the action on his rifle. But next time we won't be answering the door. The storm broke 2 days later, but Kaya couldn't leave. The fever had come and gone, but the leg needed time. And Silas needed help. Winter was the season of hunger, but it was also the season of harvest. The trapline he had checked before the storm had yielded 4 beavers and a large buck deer. Silas dragged the buck into the lean-to attached to the cabin. He began skinning it, his knife working with practiced dullness. He intended to salt the hide and sell it to the trader in the spring for 50 cents. Maybe buy some coffee. Kaya hobbled out, leaning on a crutch Silas had fashioned from a pine branch. She watched him work. She shook her head. You waste it, she said. Silas looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Waste what? I'm taking the meat. I'm taking the hide. You make. Rawhide, she said, spitting the word like it was an insult. Hard. Useless. Good for shoe soles. Nothing else. It's all I know how to do. Kaya moved closer. She took the knife from his hand. I show you. You save my life. I make you rich. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not just labor. It was a lesson in chemistry that no university in the East could teach. Kaya explained the principle of brain tanning. The spirit of the animal gives the solution, she explained as Silas cracked open the skull of the deer. The brain has the oil, the fat that likes water. Silas didn't know the word lecithin, but he watched as Kaya mixed the mashed brain with warm water until it looked like a pale, frothy soup. Then came the work. Silas had thought he was a hard worker. He was wrong. Kaya drove him like a drill sergeant. Step 1, fleshing. They spent hours scraping every ounce of meat and membrane from the hide using a sharpened bone tool Kaya made. If you leave fat, it rots, she scolded. Step 2, the soak. They rubbed the brain mixture into the hide. Kaya worked it with her bare hands, massaging the emulsified fats deep into the collagen fibers. It was messy, visceral work. Step 3, the breaking. This was the day Silas almost quit. The hide began to dry. As the water evaporated, the fibers wanted to glue themselves back together into hard rawhide. To prevent this, the hide had to be stretched. Constantly. For 6 hours they stood on opposite sides of a smooth wooden post. Silas pulled. Kaya pulled. They dragged the hide back and forth, breaking the fibers, forcing them to stay open and soft. Sweat poured down Silas's back. His arms burned. Rest, he gasped. No, Kaya shouted. If you stop it hardens, we lose. They worked in a rhythm. Pull, grunt, pull, grunt. It was a dance of exhaustion. But in that struggle, something shifted. They weren't strangers anymore. They were a machine, a team. Silas looked at Kaya. Her jaw set, her eyes fierce, and felt a respect he hadn't felt for another human being in 20 years. When the hide was finally soft, white, and fluffy, as flannel, Kaya wasn't done. She sewed it into a bag and hung it over a smudge fire of rotten wood. Why, Silas asked. The smoke locks the spirit, she said. Without smoke, water makes it hard again. With smoke, it stays soft forever. The aldehydes in the smoke penetrated the leather, waterproofing the collagen. The finished buckskin flowed like velvet in Silas's rough hands, smelling of wood smoke and wildness. Kaya didn't just teach him a trade, she gave him silence. Trading his heavy boots for her handmade moccasins, Silas moved across the floor without a sound. You gave me my legs back, he marveled. Kaya smiled gently. You gave me my life back. Winter became a sanctuary. Between reading the Sears catalog and learning the language of crows, Silas dared to imagine a future where he wasn't alone. But the spring thaw brought a sudden, empty silence. One morning, Kaya was gone. She left no note, only a fortune in tanned hides and an eagle feather amulet. In the territory, goodbyes were a luxury for those sure of return. Safe travels, girl, Silas whispered to the melting tracks. 5 years later, as barbed wire and steam engines began to tame the Wild West, Silas remained. He was a legend now, the maker of the finest buckskin in Wyoming. He had money enough to leave, but he stayed on his mountain, walking in his silent shoes, guarding the memory of the winter that healed his soul. In the brutal winter of 1885, a starving Shoshone war party swept through the valley, burning everything in